it's quite a privilege to be speaking kind of in amongst a very experienced group of experts, really. Okay, so I've introduced myself already. It's a bit high. Okay, from the Bertha Center for Social Innovation. I'm going to concentrate on a couple of areas in this talk. I've been specifically asked to talk about our involvement with government and how we've been structuring our Impact Bond Innovation Fund in conjunction with the Western Cape Provincial Government. And then I'll just give you a little bit more meat about the fund itself in the second half of the presentation. So we've engaged with government on a number of different levels, a kind of a technical level. In other words, are impact bonds legal within our regulatory framework? On a kind of budgetary level, can we afford to do it? And then on a sector level, so how is this strategically fitting into existing departmental plans? I don't know how much you know about South Africa. Probably know a heck of a lot more about Oscar Pistorius than you ever thought you'd know. And maybe you know about our president's new pool. Maybe? No. But I just wanted to give you sort of a few pieces of information you might find helpful in framing kind of the political landscape. So first of all, we have a national development plan that was published in 2012. It's a roadmap for development in South Africa and extends till 2030. It is a plan with which the national government hope that national and provincial strategies align, and there are resources that are specifically set aside in order to achieve those goals as set out in that plan. We have 3 spheres of government, so national, provincial, and local. They're autonomous, they're not hierarchical, although they're obviously interdependent and interrelated. The ANC, or African National Congress, they are the ruling party in South Africa, so they control parliament, and they rule 8 of the 9 provinces. We sit in a province that is ruled by the official opposition, so the Democratic Alliance, so that would be the Western Cape. Okay, so let's, I suppose, just move into the technical aspect. So obviously one of the tasks we've had is to kind of understand the regulatory framework and interrogate the impact bond model in the light of that. There are a number of acts and laws that have come up that we've needed to test the model against. The first and probably most draconian being the Public Finance Management Act, and the local version of that, which is the Municipal Finance Management Act. In fact, a lot of this interrogation happened last year when the Bertha Center, in conjunction with a local intermediary, Genesis Analytics and Social Finance, did an exploratory study on SIBs for business development services. And so we worked quite closely with the Government Technical Advisory Center, GTAC. They were happy for us to continue with the design of the current Impact Bond Innovation Fund, but they weren't willing to put anything in writing. In other words, they want a finished product or fund design in front of them before they can actually ratify the process. The second area that we needed to look into was the issue of PPPs, which are governed by Regulation 16, of which impact bond models are not. So it's actually just a form of outsourcing, but that was another area of concern for our government. So in terms of outsourcing, we're looking at a procurement process. Our procurement processes are governed by 5 principles: fairness, equity, transparency, competition, and cost effectiveness. I would say about 80 to 90% of each procurement decision depends on the cost effectiveness of the intervention. Perhaps what might be slightly interesting and unique to South Africa in terms of the other 4 aspects would be the equity part. So we have a preferential procurement policy framework, which is governed by our broad-based Black Economic Empowerment, BBEE, which you may have heard of. I don't want to go into detail about that, but basically it means that companies that show certain levels of previously disadvantaged ownership, management, donations, etc., have a greater chance of winning a tender. Okay, so we get the legalities out the way. We've established the kind of legalities, but actually the trick is in the practical implementation. So the government has not given the green light for the go-ahead. And I'll give you kind of an anecdotal roundup of the journey that we've been on with both national and provincial treasury to give you an idea of the complexity involved. So obviously we had a relationship with GTAC to the point where they flew down a representative to the Western Cape provincial government, where we're currently working, just to give the provincial treasury head a degree of comfort. He wasn't comforted by that fact, and insisted that we actually engage with a different division within National Treasury. So that was the Intergovernmental Relations Department. They are specifically concerned with the provincial budgets, so standardizing across the 9 provincial budgets and the governance issues surrounding that. IGR threw up another few questions which we are grappling with at the moment. One of them is that if we do this in the Western Cape, then they do need to standardize across the different provinces, and so we are most likely going to have to present to an interprovincial technical committee. And they are very loath to set up a specialist unit to deal with innovative finance mechanisms. In other words, if we want to set up an innovation fund or an impact bond, it really needs to fit as simply as possible into existing procurement mechanisms. So that's a challenge in the design, and that will be working kind of closely with commercial teams within government when we get to a procurement phase. Okay, so budgetary engagement. I think like most countries, we're in a time of fiscal constraint. So our growth, for instance, in South Africa is downgraded in November in the latest budget speech from 2.7 to 1.4, probably in line with the global slowdown, but also we have very specific labor issues, so mining strikes over the course of this year and rolling blackouts across the country. So there's money available, but there's not a lot of it, and you have to be very tight in your motivation. So for raising kind of finance for a fund. I think that's would be the same with governments around the world, let alone governments in developing countries. So just maybe a little bit, this might be a bit irrelevant, but in terms of the division of our revenue, we found that to be interesting, especially working in early childhood development. So there's an equitable share that gets distributed amongst the 9 provinces according to population. So for instance, you get a certain pot for child services. Actually, early childhood development is not a mandatory service in South Africa. It's subject to progressive realization. And so at any point, the government could pull funding from an ECD program to put into what is a mandatory service, say child protection or foster care. And because the pot is actually not big enough to cover everything, this is an issue. The equitable share is unconditional, and that means that the provinces have autonomy over their own spend. So they might adhere to the national policy, but their implementation plans are different. It means that if you're working in ECD and you're working in different provinces, you need to be motivating individually to each province if you want to spend their money on your ECD program. We've got the same kind of budget silo issues as there are around the world. In terms of our budgeting cycle, it's a 3-year medium-term expenditure framework. It's extremely difficult to motivate for anything over that time frame and impossible to motivate for anything longer than 5 years, which is our elective cycle. So anything that we do will need to be 3 years maximum. So in terms of current priorities, I think, in most developing contexts, scale is the issue. Not always necessarily scaling of quality. We'd like it to be scaling of quality, but almost kind of simply scale. And so an impact bond, certainly the way that we think about it, and just in terms of that question about the kind of development trajectory, where do we fit into that scale, that scaling question? And it certainly doesn't seem to be at this point towards the end of that trajectory. I think we're kind of situated just after the kind of fragmented pilot and program stage, perhaps a little bit more kind of organized in a stepping stone, as I say, to strengthening organizations to scale. And that second point there, attracting new forms of funding. We have to be quite careful about how we frame impact bonds. So when government officials first hear about them, they think, oh, excellent, it's a new stream of funding. You know, we've augmented our funding. We don't have to pay for stuff anymore. And obviously, the government is the outcomes funder. So yes, they're only paying for successful outcomes, and we're working very hard to make sure that those outcomes are successful. But ultimately, they are paying. As people have mentioned earlier today, we can't sell it on the basis of cost savings, which perhaps in some developed countries you can do. You have to convince people on the basis of added value. In other words, you're creating you're helping an individual to potentially become more economically productive as they kind of reach adulthood. So, what then would be potentially hard incentives that you could use to encourage government departments to take up these programs, if indeed you feel that that's the right thing for them to do? And one of the avenues that we're exploring is augmenting our outcomes funding pot with private capital. And so we've approached corporates, for instance, and we'll continue to approach other donors and see if they want to potentially contribute either in the Western Cape, or if we extend the fund to maybe some poorer provinces within South Africa. The other incentive for government engagement, because even though at this point they're not contributing any funding towards it, they are contributing their time. And so we're spending a lot of time with government stakeholders. And I think they're incentivized, as I was chatting with David earlier, about the degree of analysis that's taking place and the rigor with which that analysis is taking place and the lens through which we're looking at their services. And so it's a very different lens than they're used to looking at. A lot of people that we've engaged with very much appreciate that and will continue to contribute their time as a result of that alone, even if we don't get to the capital raising part of this design. Current priority is market building. It's not our government's priority to build an impact bond market. That's more kind of our job at the moment. Well, not our job. And we're certainly not doing it alone as the Bertha Centre. There are various other local intermediaries that have undergone various, have carried out various feasibility studies, etc. We have partnered with social finance, so obviously we have the benefit of that kind of international expert work that they've done, kind of leading the field. And what has been particularly evident is not only their willingness to consult to us and with us, but also their intention to build local capacity. So they, through us, obviously, we as an organization are learning huge amounts, but through us, we're an academic institution, that reach will go reasonably far through training and workshops and roundtable discussions, etc. We are being also, the market itself is being funded. We're not getting, as I say, any money from government. We're being funded by foundations. So last year, the exploratory study was through Flanders, and this Impact Bond Innovation Fund design is through Lego Foundation, through UBS Optimus, through Amidia, so a lot of the usual suspects. Thank you to those organizations. That I see as will be the case for the kind of foreseeable future. Who knows when the government will potentially see an advantage in starting to fund the earlier work in the design process. So moving on to kind of strategic sector engagement, and this is where the majority of the time has been spent. The technical engagement, National Treasury, that'll happen on a continual basis as we get kind of shunted from party to party. But actually what's been really helpful up front is the engagement that we've had specifically with the departments around early childhood development. So it's been it's been kind of cross collaboration that's been happening between the tiers of government, so not only provincial, but talking to National DSD, talking to the National Planning Commission, who are in charge of overseeing the National Development Plan. So ensuring that there is awareness around this at national level, as they might provide a conduit to other provinces, if indeed it turns out to be valuable. Interdepartmentally, we're working with social development, health, education within the Western Cape, who, are actually at a point where a lot of those conversations are happening already. So there is quite a lot of cross-departmental talking that's happening. There's just not a lot of cross-departmental implementation that's happening. And so they don't have a mechanism to pool funding, for instance. And so this is quite interesting from the point of view of pooling not only resources and training, but also pooling funding, potentially. And then a lot of cross-sector collaboration. So we have a number of sector experts on our sort of steering committee and advisory board. Again, they're used to working with government, and particularly in early childhood development, there's a lot of cross-pollination between sectors. I'm going to skip over planning cycle. Government priorities, I think I've talked about that as well in the panel. We are very conscious of not just parachuting our ideas onto the sector. And so part of this engagement is really going deep into what's already happening and where we could contribute could most valuably. One of the things that immediately has been raised is that, it's evident, is that we have great policies. So our policies, including the National Development Plan, are generally evidence-based, written by sector experts, very well received generally. We just have terrible social outcomes. And a lot of that has to do with implementation. And so there's a huge potential in using an impact bond to drive successful implementation of this policy. So getting decision makers and champions in the room, I'm sure anyone who's setting up an impact bond at the moment knows the importance of doing that. I think in terms of champions, our director at the Bertha Centre, Francois Benici, has quite a long-standing relationship with the head of the public policy unit in the Western Cape government. And she is a champion of the project. And in fact, I now sit in her offices for 2 days a week. So there's a lot of kind of cross-learning that happens there. I get involved in various work streams of theirs and make sure that they're up to date with what we're doing as well. So that has definitely opened up, we've been made aware of a lot of programs that are currently in operation that we otherwise wouldn't have known about. So it's been really helpful being on the ground and embedded in government. And then in terms of decision makers, you don't always have to have the decision maker in the room, but it definitely helps. What might be surprising to some people is that we've never pitched this idea to a politician. So we're working with civil servants at the moment and bureaucrats. I think we're not sure, but we're assuming that, if this has legs, that then they would probably present this concept to a politician. There are a number of reasons. I'll just give a couple of reasons why we haven't approached any ministers around this fund. One of them is that we haven't needed to. So we feel like the people that we're talking with have a sufficient authority to make decisions. The second is that we're working in the Western Cape, and as I mentioned, it's the only DA-run province in South Africa. There's obviously quite a lot of political tension around that, and we're very careful about remaining politically agnostic. So we don't want a particular political party hijacking the idea as their own and putting off everyone else in the process. And so we're just being very sensitive around that. In terms of M&E, I think it's also been mentioned that data and metrics in the developing world is not as robust as it could be, and there's definite opportunities to strengthen existing M&E, and certainly in the early childhood development sort of sphere. We're actually collaborating with a number of international organizations as well, like Brookings, for instance, and Save the Children. I think there was a Save the Children person in the room. But they are bringing out a developmental assessment tool, and there's a potential, for instance, for the fund to provide a pilot site for them. And so it's balancing the rigor of the tool and the investors' requirements against this development agenda. In other words, how can we create something that is not just bespoke for this project, but then potentially could be scaled to the rest of the province or even nationally if it proves to be effective in this rather large live pilot. So we're really actively seeking that sort of synergy with other things that are happening on the ground, which makes it complicated but very exciting. So I suppose another question you may ask is, what is a university doing playing in this space? There are a number of, I think, attributes that we have that perhaps would help us in our endeavor. I think two of them are that we only have 2 people in our team, but we're extremely excited by this prospect. And so I think both myself and Arnie Patton have certainly made a lot of personal decisions that have led us to this place. I think as a university organization, we are relatively non-threatening. So we're a neutral convener. People are happy to and feel quite comfortable convening with other sector players at the university. And we already have quite deep relationships in business, investment, government, etc., that we can tap into. I think the University of Cape Town specifically is quite a credible source of knowledge. So if we're producing documentation and we're disseminating information, we have kind of a reputable institution's name behind us. So it means we have to be particularly rigorous. And we're educators. So there's we don't want to hold on to any of this information. We don't need to make any money out of it. We are testing the idea and we are disseminating it to as many people as possible. And that includes to our intermediary market. So we're quite committed to harnessing their existing skills, and we've got quite a sophisticated intermediary market, not necessarily in this particular area, but certainly they are very willing to start taking part. And so that's another area where social finance will be sort of taking the lead in terms of passing on information and skills. And obviously, eventually that will kind of bring the cost down. They'll be pricing according to local prices, etc. Okay, so moving on to the actual project itself. It started at the beginning of November, so we started with a whole series of meetings, and Jane Newman and Johnny Gill came out, we've been mining data and talking to a lot of stakeholders. We hope by the second quarter of next year, so that's when the budgeting cycle starts in the provinces, to have a rate card ready for them to kind of evaluate and to push back on. Once we have that, we will start to build a kind of operational plan, financial model, business case around that rate card. I would say that, I mean, the work in terms of our collaboration with social finance is front-loaded, so that's where their expertise definitely lie, and we wouldn't be able to do it without them. I think as we move further along, and the next steps of the process will very much depend on whether we can secure outcomes funding, first of all, and also will depend on the various government stakeholders as to their time availability in setting up procurement processes, etc. But that second half of the project will be done in close conjunction with our commercial teams and government and procurement teams. So as I mentioned earlier, we want to create something that's really simple, really replicable. You don't need to build a huge amount of capacity within government to be able to roll these or manage these contracts. So that's a priority. And I mean, all along we are engaging with national, we're also engaging specifically with another province in the form, through our partnership with Lego, but also in the fact that one of the bigger organization representatives, ECD representatives in KwaZulu-Natal, is on our board, and so we're already putting feelers out in that respect. I don't have much to say about that slide, and I was wondering whether I should leave it in, but I did. But that's a beautiful PowerPoint diagram of the Outcomes Fund. Okay, so one of the questions we've been asked by our funders, especially in media, is why go to the extent of creating an innovation fund when you could just create a simple impact bond? Is this not a little bit ambitious? And there are a number of reasons that why we've decided to do a fund rather. One obvious one is that there's no standout organization that could scale up and roll out across the province. So we want to test numerous interventions and delivery models. We want to create a really robust set of data around those outcomes that are being produced. We want to be able to compare the cost of delivery to different beneficiary groups. So I'm not talking about sort of, I'm still talking within the kind of lower quintiles in terms of socioeconomic groups. But for instance, how much does it cost to get a child to a certain set of outcomes, the poorest quintile versus the second poorest quintile? So be able to have that comparative data, which is quite helpful for government. We want to create a little bit of competition in the marketplace, so bring the price down. So when people are bidding in, obviously there'll be a cost-benefit analysis that's done on all of those bids. And so there's a bit of market play, because actually it's very difficult pricing an outcome, and we'd like as much market participation as possible in trying to establish that. And often I think, as with the DWP fund, that happens, it doesn't happen on the first round. And so there's a lot of iteration that happens within that. But we're trying to create some competition within the fund itself. Ultimately, with this, by collating this data and perhaps having a larger cohort, there would be more chance that ultimately we can motivate for an increase of equitable share to the provinces for early childhood development. So national government is in the process of setting up the funding norms and standards, which at the moment they're just doing on a cost basis. This will hopefully feed in live information about kind of what's happening on the ground and how much it's actually costing organizations to achieve those sort of target outcomes that the government has kind of put there as a kind of holy grail. At the moment, they're not paying anywhere near what they would need to get to that point. And then I think just also on that point, if you're doing a single impact bond with a single organization, then the conversation tends to stay within that select group, and we've wanted to open up the concept as wide as possible. And so this is one way of doing it. We speak to a lot of investors. a lot of practitioners on an individual and workshop basis, and obviously quite a number of government departments as well. So that is the reason. That is a list of activities to date. Very impressive. There was one thing that I think I've mentioned everything on that slide. Yeah, I think just in terms of site visits. And so it's been actually one of the more helpful and interesting parts of the process thus far. In other words, I don't come from an ECD sector, and I mean, we've basically come from a finance background sector, and so it's really helpful chatting to people on the ground to see what is and isn't possible. So we want to be ambitious, but we want to be realistic. In terms of where we are thus far in our thinking, anyone in the ECD sector will not be surprised by the division of the cohort into first 1,000 days and 2 to 3 year olds. So these are relatively well established kind of cohort groups, first 1,000 days being conception to 2 years. And 3 to 4 year olds are the 2 years before grade R in South Africa, which is our reception year. In the first 1,000 days, we're looking at predominantly health and nutrition outcomes, but there's a lot of interest around early stimulation and parental outcomes. And a lot of the work that's being done by perhaps Save the Children and Brookings is they're trying to account for maturation effects within that cohort to be able to evaluate early stimulation programs, which is quite exciting. We're looking at community-based programs in that area, so very much preventative. In South Africa, we have a relatively well-established health departments, clinics, etc., but there's not a massive uptake of preventative primary health services. And so what these community-based organizations do is they take a geographic area and they basically walk house to house and knock on every door and identify whether there are pregnant women or children in that house, and then they talk about things like breastfeeding, HIV, early stimulation, immunization, etc. So a broad range of topics that are brought up on that basis. And then our main funders in that area are Department of Health. But obviously what we would like to do is bring, because this is and the government is committed to this being an integrated service, so early childhood development, sort of being an integrated convergence of different services, they would be interested in combining or pooling funding and working with this as a mechanism to pool funding going forward. And then in terms of 3 to 4 year olds, looking predominantly at early learning outcomes. And here, there are a lot of tricky aspects to this particular cohort, including the fact that 60% of kids in the Western Cape in this age group have no access to any service. So they go completely off the grid from the age of 18 months to 5 when they go back to school again. They have to be able to afford to go to an ECD centre because it's not, well, it's partly government subsidised, but the ECD centres are fee-based. And so the poorest of the poor who cannot afford the 100 Rand a month it costs for them to send their kids to school, so that's about £6 a month for 10 hours childcare a day. 60% of people can't afford that, and there is then the complexity around how do you reach the kind of poorest of the poor when the existing service providers are working with the less poor of the poor. And yeah, Department of Social Development would be the main outcomes funder there. And that's all I have to say for now. So, are there any questions?
Thank you so much, Susan. That was very interesting. Catalina Guy from the Center for Global Development. I have several questions, but I'll just ask one to keep it short. You said that the National Development Plan that South Africa implemented led to really bad social outcomes. Can you explain why that occurred, and which kind of mechanisms did they use to implement the plan?
I think, yeah, no one quote that, by the way. I hope that's not what... What I meant is that we, just in terms of policy, we have sound policies, generally, but there's a mismatch between that policy and the implementation of that policy, and it doesn't necessarily result in quality outcomes. In terms of the National Development Plan, it's almost too early to tell what the outcomes will be. So there's a lot of fanfare about the National Development Plan. There's a lot of hope for it, and so people are really sort of combining their energies and resources in order to ensure that the goals are achieved around the National Development Plan. But we've had many plans before that haven't achieved what we wanted to achieve. And so there is also that degree of skepticism around it. But the National Development Plan, it really only comes to the end of its life in 2030. So it's really just taking a long-term view. It was written, the guy that headed it up, the writing of the plan was our previous Minister of Finance, Trevor Manuel. And so he was basically set down a number of key areas, sort of 11 areas, where he felt that were the building blocks to the next step. And so and early child development is one of them. So I think that we're quite lucky in that respect, but there is a bit of momentum around that from that level.